Hello and welcome to the Women Leading Show. This is our fourth show in our first season, and I'm really excited to have a fantastic special guest. We have another one, hopefully, that's literally going to fly in from San Diego. Dr. Alessandra Wall hasn't joined us as yet, but hopefully she will. But I'm really thrilled today to see Tara Halliday, not only because she's an amazing guest, but she's just been telling us how you've actually just had COVID. So thank you for joining us post-COVID.
I'm delighted to be here, I have to say.
Well, it sounds like you've had quite a time, but thank you, just the mild version, if that is such a thing. Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks for joining us. And obviously I've got my wonderful co-hosts, Kim-Adele Platts. Hello, Kim. Oh, she's muted herself, bless her, because she's doing all the back.
I'm moving people around, but it's nice to be chatting with you all.
Fantastic to have you. Kim does a lot of the background work for me and keeps everything flowing smoothly, which is just so fantastic. And my other co-host, Jo Sumner, who's actually just up the road from me. Hello, Jo.
Hi, guys. Really good to be here. Looking forward to today's discussion.
Oh, same here. So we are going to have one of the biggest topics that gets talked about for women. But maybe that's just the nature of the conversations I have. But imposter syndrome is a huge problem, but we're going to come on to that a bit later on. To start with, we always talk about something that's topical. And this week, we've had the brilliant announcement that Kamala Harris is going to run for VP in the US, which is just amazing on so many levels. But Sarah Palin, very interestingly, posted her top tips for Kamala, which was really helpful. It's always good to help other women up the ladder. And one of the issues she raised was trust. In fact, she recommended, and it was tip number 1, to not trust anyone new. So trust no one that comes into your network that is new, presumably because do you know where they're coming from? What are they going to be doing? Are they trying to jump on the bandwagon? So let's get started with, I don't know, let's hear from Jo Sumner first about trust, and what's your views on this, these comments and this so-say advice?
Actually, my initial thought was a lack of surprise and a feeling of good on her for just saying it, because I suspect that's actually an experience candidates have again and again, is that they get to that point that they may potentially have been working towards for a long time, and suddenly they get an influx of new staff. That's what Sarah Palin was saying. You'll have a sudden influx of new people, and they'll have a different agenda. And I actually loved how she wrapped up her advice. And this surprises me because I'm not actually a Sarah Palin fan at all. But I loved how she wrapped it up, which was to remind Kamala Harris that she'd been chosen for who she was and who she is. And to remember that, to not allow herself to be changed too much by all of these. You get this impression that what Sarah was trying to say is like all these vultures who come in and they've got a particular party job to get done. So a lack of surprise. I always feel it's a tremendous pity that politics is not a kinder place and is so much, it feels like such a showboating affair, particularly I always find in American politics, though maybe I shouldn't say that as I'm not American, maybe I don't have the right, and that you get squeezed, almost the more integrity you have, the more squeezed you become. So I actually really felt a lot of sympathy in that, felt a lot of what's the right word? I admired her for just saying it and saying it outright like that. And hopefully Kamala Harris has a really solid head on her shoulders and perhaps even knew some of that already and is able to stay who she really is.
Yeah, brilliant. I think it's really true, and it's a tough world, let alone for a woman to rise through the ranks, because obviously the numbers are still horribly terrible, proportionally of how many women there are. So let's go to Kim now. Kim, what do you think? What are your thoughts? Do you trust people you've just met, or do you or does your guard stay up?
So I'm a big one for trust. I think that you should trust people until they prove you wrong, because the majority of people won't prove you wrong. But we've got a gut instinct, and the thing we have to trust most is that. I think you get a very early warning sign about whether or not somebody's lips and hips match, if what they say and what they do seem to be showing up appropriately. And I think for me, that's the indicator. I'm careful how much I trust. So while I say I trust people to start off with, I don't trust them with everything. But I think you've got to start from a place of treating people in the way that you would treat them if they were trusted, with certain bits of information, and then you can work out for yourself if you'd give them more. But I do think it is clearly the result of people having experienced others who haven't deserved their trust, and I think that has happened to all of us, and it is sad. It's a shame that we can't all be more honest and have a bit more integrity, but I think you've got to try and keep yourself safe. And I think, Jo, as you said, the advice to not allow others to change you is great advice, and we can all come under some knocks for that. And I know obviously we'll get into that later on in the show on the imposter piece, but I think trying to stay true to who we are is perhaps our most crucial skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a mixture, isn't it, of staying true to yourself, but also letting people in, because we all need to grow our tribes to get to where we want to go. And if you are holding back on the trust and trusting no one, then how can you grow your tribe? Because you'll keep yourself stuck with the same amount of people. I liked what you said, Kim, that actually we need to just realize that we have an intuition, and we need to turn the volume button up to maximum, especially in politics. I've worked a lot in politics myself. And with one of the authors from the book, Sonal Badiani, who will be a guest on our show, our next show. She has had incredible value and worth thrown back at her by trusting her team. And I know she found it hard. She's a woman who didn't have the biggest confidence to go into politics and run as a member of parliament. But the more she trusted and valued her own intuition, the better it got, the bigger her team got, and the more successful was her campaign. So it's a really interesting one. Let's go to Tara before we flip on to Imposter Syndrome. What do you think, Tara?
There we are. Yes, so fascinating question. I think with all things like this, the statement "trust no one," it's a very bold and snappy and looks good on Twitter and things, but it's too broad. If you absolutely trusted absolutely nobody, then you'd be completely isolated and have no interactions. As a society, we're all about give and take, and there is an element of trust. It's a natural part. It is the social contract. And so what do you do with that? Well, you still have to use discernment. I think that's where her advice was going, that you have to use discernment and be careful. And there's also then trust whom with what. There's all sorts of things. You can trust certain people with specific things, but I'm definitely with Kim in erring towards the side of trusting people, because when you trust people, that's where you're going to get your support from. And that's a crucial thing. And I think that's going to be very, very necessary in the upcoming election, to be able to have that support around her, as well as, not isolate herself.
Yeah, no, definitely. And actually, you've just done a great post on LinkedIn about progression and about success, and compared successful business people and leaders to sportsmen and women who are top of their game. But I'm going to let you go on to that in a second. I think it's really important. And I think it's, do you trust yourself? If you can't trust yourself, then I can see why you wouldn't want to trust people around you. But I think actually, sadly, we have to break this distrust, and it's become very common for people to distrust. And like you said, Jo, in politics, it is a very atrocious and difficult environment. But actually, by trusting other women, other men, and anyone that you really feel like you can, we can start to change that energy and that dynamic, and get better people like Kamala into politics. And God, who knows, she might be VP. wow, what an amazing idea. That just gives me goosebumps to think that someone like her could become VP for the US. Yeah, so really exciting. Okay, so let's introduce our special guest today. As I've already said, hopefully, our doctor from Chicago, Alessandra, will join us at some point. She's possibly having technical difficulties, or something's happened. Things can happen right now. So at the moment, I'm just going to have the full attention, thankfully, of Tara Halliday. I'm just going to give you a very quick intro, Tara. And she's just throwing something else at me that I didn't know about Tara. But I'm going to come on to that in a second. So Tara Halliday is a coach and trainer for high performers with imposter syndrome. With 20 years experience, her work develops authenticity, resilience, and effortless confidence. What an amazing statement. We all want effortless confidence, but it's not that easy, is it? She also has a degree, but not the average degree you would expect from someone. But then I can relate to that because I've got some weird degrees too. Hi, Tara. Thank you for joining us on the show.
Hi, thank you. So is your question what the degree is?
Well, go on, tell us that, because when people are watching, they're kind of thinking, well, what's she talking about?
yeah. Well, it's a PhD in engineering, and so it's very interesting that I would be where I am from engineering. But when I was looking at where to go in terms of my career as a teenager, I wanted to be a psychologist, but my family didn't approve. So I did something that they approved of more. And so I had a 10-year career in engineering before I finally got back to what I love.
Wow, and what a fascinating kind of story. I wonder how many, and I put my hand up here, how many of us actually go down the path initially, especially higher education, that is just to sort of fit the mold and appease our parents. I know a lot of people that do. So I'm going to pass you over to Kim, because Kim is going to start your session off and raise a very, very important point.
Okay, so Tara, lovely to have you on here. And I know, obviously, the main point of today is to talk through imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is something that we know is predominantly talked about for women, but is also prevalent in men. I think it was Albert Einstein who said that the high esteem within which his works are held leaves him feeling like an unlikely swindler. So it feels like it doesn't matter how successful or how much of a genius you are, you're not necessarily not going to fall victim to it. So in all your experience, what do you think has been one of the main causes for people who have imposter syndrome and how they can identify it?
So yeah, sure. So imposter syndrome, which for those who might not know what it is, it's the secret feeling of being a fraud when you're not, and the fear of being found out. And it affects 70% of high achievers at some point in their career, Albert Einstein included. Now, how many, what about the other 30%? Well, there'll be some of people in there who are not aware of it, or maybe they haven't tripped over it yet. And so personally, I feel the numbers are larger. And yes, men and women are equally is the other part of it. So the original research was on women. 1978, they studied graduate students who were women in a university. And that's when the imposter phenomenon came out. And then more studies showed it tended towards women. But then in 1997, a new study came out in which they'd made the polls anonymous. And suddenly the numbers were 50-50, men and women equally. And what we were looking at was a bias towards, men being generally uncomfortable sharing something that they might consider to be a weakness, or other people might be considered a weakness. So the experience of imposter syndrome is often a surprise because it shows up in highly successful, highly competent people. So intellectually, they know they can do this work. They know they can do this job. They've got the experience and the history to prove it. But it's like they don't quite believe it. They're not feeling it on the inside, and they're doubting it. And so when the imposter syndrome shows up, it's it's like being struck with a sudden lack of confidence. So people often chase, oh, I need to get more confidence, but it's not confidence that's the issue. It's the situation they found themselves in. So imposter syndrome, feeling like a fraud, fearing that people are going to find you out any minute, that is triggered by a combination of high challenge and low support. And personally, I think this is why it shows so much up in highly successful people, because as they get promoted, as their jobs expand and they get to do more things, they get higher and higher challenge all the time. And unless the support keeps up with them, then they can be liable to imposter syndrome. There are several things that you might notice, not just that self-doubt where maybe it wasn't there before, but there's things like procrastination, perfectionism, over-preparing, deflecting praise. There's this saying, oh, that wasn't me, or oh, oh, I just got lucky. There's, they're not really believing that they deserve to be in that spot. And another one is not having enough qualifications. Maybe if I just get another certification, another degree, another something, then maybe that will prove that I'm good enough. And what underlies all of imposter syndrome is a belief about our worth, our fundamental worth as a human being. And that belief is my worth depends on what I do. And it doesn't sound so bad to start off with, but it means that if I do something good, I am good. If I do something bad, I am bad. And that means we're mixing up our identity and our worth with our actions. And that leaves us very vulnerable to the circumstances that I mentioned of high challenge and low support.
Wow, sorry, a bit late on unmuting there. Yeah, so because I know Kim, I know obviously you'll be happy to share this, but you have a career which has been X, and obviously you're doing something very different, which is definitely now a Y, or a chalk and cheese career. So I think there's probably a lot of that I know you relate to.
Oh no, absolutely. And as you were saying it, I was seeing a lot of the things that I've gone through. I mean, I did. Sorry, just for you really. I started off as a hairdresser, and then I ended up being a board level CEO for a FTSE 250, constantly convinced that they were going to find out that they'd got a hairdresser on the board and turf me off. So like every day I went in going, oh my God, they're just going to work out that I'm not capable of this. And yet for 20 years I continued to operate at that level, and it was fine. But you suddenly realise that actually it's very, very hard, because whilst you don't want to get found out, while you do feel like a fraud, you have this ridiculous conversation in your head where you have to go in anyway, because the one way that's guaranteed they're going to find out that you're a fraud is if you just don't turn up. Yeah. So you kind of have to go, you have to keep putting yourself into the situation to feel afraid of being found out, because you're afraid of being found out, which is kind of sounds counterintuitive, but was how I lived for a lot of years, until I had to do that piece that said, actually, you've muddled your self-worth with what it is that you're doing. So totally resonated with me. And I think, for me personally, my turning point was having my little girl, because I realized that the voice we talk to ourselves becomes the voice we teach our children to talk to themselves. And that broke my heart. Because whilst I do my best to be kind and be empathetic with the world, I'm not a very nice person to myself. I could say some horrendous things that I would never dream of saying to anybody else. And you kind of think the person that is with you constantly, the only constant in your life is you. And you've got to be kinder to yourself. You've got to understand it. And I almost wonder whether or not it is really imposter syndrome, or whether it's a symptom of being an insecure overachiever, because you kind of, I guess to your point, you kind of don't get it until you've achieved something, and it's high achievers that seem to stumble into it faster.
Yeah.
Is that right, Tara? Is it just high achievers, or does it sort of come down to actually anyone that just suddenly finds themselves progressing rather quickly, or just finding their new feet in a new environment?
It's triggered by a combination of high challenge and low support. So, you know, if you're, say, a baker, and you know, every day you go in and you bake the same cakes and then the same bread, and you know, you learned it 20 years ago, and it's a routine. There's no challenge in there, so imposter syndrome isn't going to show up in there, unless you decided to enter a national baking contest and suddenly you're on TV having to create a masterpiece out of these crazy ingredients. And then you might start to feel, oh, who am I to be doing this? Or if you won, who am I to have won that? So yes, it has that that tendency to be, the more people are challenged is where it'll show up, and that's the high achievers.
Yeah, well, that's really, I think it's really relevant, because I think there's a kind of a myth that we think there are certain types of people who would suffer from imposter syndrome, and there is a type, but it's not true, is it? It really isn't. I think also when you do something for the very first time, it can always feel an element of imposter syndrome, but it's always about how you deal with it. But Jo, have you suffered from imposter syndrome? So you've worn many different hats in your wonderful, colourful life.
Oh, I certainly did in my first career. My first career was medical research ethics, but my qualifications were in medieval studies and ancient Greek. And I literally was a research fellow's PA, my first job out of university. And 3 months in, she said, look, you're obviously overqualified for this role. How would you like to be my research assistant? And then from that, I developed an academic career, and I just wasn't qualified. You know, there was no way around it. I was bright and had been taught how to think, but I wasn't qualified in the field. And so I feel like I had a completely justified experience of imposter syndrome, but did what Kim talked about, which is, in order for that, you know, not to come crashing down around me, I had to keep showing up, keep doing the work, keep getting better. And over time, what enabled me to finally release that was realizing, sheer number of years on the job, I now absolutely had the experience. And that I had quite a unique experience, because I came in as a more uncluttered thinker. Because I hadn't come through the MA programs in medical ethics, I wasn't thinking in the same way. I was thinking much more like an ordinary member of the public. And that was actually a really valuable thing to bring to the organization. So I rewrote my script around it to make it much clearer to myself, the value that I brought. But I wanted to ask the question, which is, what's the solution? Because one solution for me, the challenge didn't go away. The challenge in that career just kept on amping up. But what did change was more support. I found an ally. And then, having found one ally who validated the gaining of that experience and the value I was adding, I had the confidence to find another ally, to find another ally, to find another ally. And by the time I left that career, I had a whole network of people around the country that were part of that support network. So I became actually incredibly well supported in my role, and actually left at a point where I was really comfortable and I needed a new challenge. So I wonder if that's part of the answer, Tara, is part of the answer that you have to find more support.
Okay, yeah, yes and no, partially. So if you get more support, which you illustrated beautifully there, actually, if you get more support, then the trigger for imposter syndrome goes away. And so that is absolutely the solution. This is why I would like to see high achievers getting more support, like the athletes get the support, because that's what's going to be helpful and allow them to really do their best and not burn out. Because the alternative is, you know, as Kim was saying, showing up and just pushing through it is exhausting, can lead to burnout and people ending careers. But to actually get rid of imposter syndrome, there's 3 parts to it. First, you have to calm everything down. So getting more support calms down the trigger of imposter syndrome. Calming down the imposter syndrome behaviors is going to help. And then calming down your physiology. So we go into this fight, flight, or freeze nervous system state. And that changes the way, literally changes the way we think, and it changes our resourcefulness. It lowers our resourcefulness. So the first step is calm, all those three things. Then the second step is clear, to clear out the belief that underlies it, the belief around our unconditional worth. Because if you don't get rid of that, what will happen with imposter syndrome is it'll keep repeating. It'll come back and back any time that there's a high challenge and low support situation. So you leave yourself open to that in the future. And then finally, the icing on the cake, if you like, is once you've got rid of the belief, cleared that belief, then you can create new success habits to replace those old dysfunctional ones, if you like, because the imposter syndrome behaviors are just the symptom of imposter syndrome. Once you get rid of the belief, that then the underlying belief about our conditional worth, then the behaviors just kind of melt like snow in the sun.
Wow, I'm sure people watching that, Tara, will like the idea of that, because so I mentor a lot of speakers, professional speakers, men and women, who absolutely, the imposter syndrome can kick in the very minute you're about to step onto stage, or obviously turn on the camera, as we're doing now. But and that's great advice. And obviously, the clear out the belief for me sounds the biggest one, the biggest challenge, because actually that takes some doing, doesn't it? It's not that easy just to sort of take a deep breath and go, oh, I've cleared that belief. There's a lot to that, isn't there, that needs to be done?
There absolutely is. You can't just, although many people advocate it, you can't just stand in the mirror and tell yourself that you're fabulous, because there's a little part of your voice going, no, you're not, no, you're not. And it's just not going to work. Particularly if you've been triggered into that fight, flight, or freeze state. So your body is screaming, hey, there's a tiger in the room, and you're trying to convince yourself that you're just fabulous and everything's okay. So it's not going to it's not going to work like that, definitely.
So what could you recommend to our viewers of how they can start that process? Obviously, they can get in touch with you, which would be the ideal scenario. But just what would be your best tips to really start looking at how you value your unconditional worth, and how you can start working on that?
Yeah, great. You're right. So the clearing out the belief is the essence of the work. That's what's really going to move it. And that would be in, coming to see someone like me who runs a program that includes that deep change belief work. But there's certainly things you can do. The very first step, most people keep imposter syndrome as a secret. And this was mentioned earlier. Tell someone, find somebody and tell them. Now, not somebody who's going to try and fix you or criticize you, and not someone who might call you out. So somebody who you might trust. So we're coming all the way back to trust here, and get that support system in place. The more you can do that, the better. And then do things to keep your physiology as calm as possible. So if you feel like you've been overwhelmed by this this wave of anxiety or fear or something, then you can shake your hands and legs, or you can do some stretches. You can go for a walk, go for a run. There's a lot of managing our physiology first that's going to help in terms of the way we feel about ourselves, because getting into the neuroscience, then it takes the brain from an emergency state to a friend state, and that's when we can sensibly then have that talk with ourselves and look at the reality of the situation. So yeah, talk to somebody and do everything that you can to get and stay as calm as you can.
Yeah, fantastic. And it's so true, isn't it? Because getting support is fairly easy to achieve on a level, but does have to be the right support, doesn't it? Because you could reach out to someone, and I know this happens with a lot of female entrepreneurs, that as you're progressing, you can reach out to someone who will support you, but not necessarily support you in the right way. And it has to be someone who kind of will relate, I suppose, to that environment, that situation. I know Kim and I, and Jo and I, we've all spoken about these tough situations, and they can relate to them. So you can then empathize in a different way, rather than just saying, oh, there, that must be tough. So I think that's why speakers, for example, really stick together, because they really understand how pressurized it is getting on a stage and speaking to hundreds of people, especially when, well, not especially, but when you're being paid a fairly good sum of money to do that as a professional, when actually we've proved in the last few months that anyone can speak professionally, really. So how is that achieved, do you think? That, you know, how do we seek out that right support? What does that need to look like?
Yeah, well, I recommend interviewing people. So you pick somebody who you think might be somebody who could support you. So not somebody who's going to try and fix you, definitely. Not somebody who's going to tell you don't be, you know, don't be stupid, and not somebody who's just going to try and convince you that you're fabulous. Because I mean, it sounds like that would be helpful, but if you're not feeling it, and somebody's telling you, oh, how wonderful you are, how wonderful you are, you'll not believe them, and you'll just disregard them, and you'll feel even more isolated and even more alone. So it has to be somebody who can definitely hear you and empathize. And so interview them, you know, have if you can get in-person meetings, have a coffee together, have a chat, and drop in a little something and see how they respond. And if they respond, you know, positive in a supportive way, then, you know, you can try another one, and you can go deeper. And you might have to interview quite a few people before you find somebody who can really be there for you, and you can explain this to, and you can talk about it and talk through things. And when you have found that person, then that stops that feeling of isolation. Then you're feeling less alone, and that's what really helps in the support.
Yeah, brilliant. And that I would say 9 times out of 10 isn't necessarily your partner or your significant other, is it? Because they'll say, you're amazing, you can do this, look at you, look at your experience, look how good you are, I love you, I'm behind you, whatever.
Yeah.
And then actually that doesn't really help, does it, unfortunately? But I want to bring it back to a really good point you raised, which was about speaking up about this. And maybe this is why we've got this misconception that women suffer more than men, because women are better at sharing when they're struggling or they have a challenge. We just generally are more open with talking about struggles that we have. So is this why women notably suffer more? Can we go into that a bit more? Why do women suffer more than men, but equally so?
I think it's the perception that women suffer more because women are more willing to speak about it. Mm-hmm. So, you see a lot of the people who've spoken up about imposter syndrome, Meryl Streep and Michelle Obama and a whole host of celebrities and things. And society has it more acceptable for a woman to express what might be considered a weakness. And men, it's almost like absolutely not. There is nobody that you can tell. So you'd be amazed at the number of people that I talk to who tell me that they have never told anyone else about their imposter syndrome, not even a partner or a spouse. So the idea that it is just women and what women suffer more is just because they're prepared to speak up about it more. And I think that's a strength, because women are generally, and of course this has to be a generalization, but generally find it easier to access support than men. And you can see this reflected also societally in that, the higher rates of suicide in men than women. It's a whole society problem.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, and it's raised the very big issue, and it's one thing that's definitely reflected in our book, because obviously this show is supporting the Women Leading book that was published and has been a bestseller. But it was really important when I started that message about it being a mixed conversation, male authors as well as female authors, because, like you say, men suffer the same challenges, and also we need to raise these issues with the norm of society and question it and change it. And I think that's really important, because you would wonder, would a male politician offer another male politician his best advice? Do you see that? You don't often see that, do you? You don't see that kind of visible support. Maybe they would in a more quiet and less discerning way. But I think that there's a whole issue, probably a whole show on society and actually the norms that we actually have to ditch and get rid of before we can really make some serious differences in equality. But I think that's really important. Jo, is there anything else because you obviously work in coaching and you probably have similar conversations with some of your clients in relation to what we talked about today?
Well, one of the things that's just been in my mind as you were talking there about differences between women and men and women's greater willingness perhaps to express what they're struggling with is actually there is research that shows that for men, it can be a source of incredible stress to share what they're struggling with if in that sharing they can't take it all the way through to a solution. So actually, with the societal change that I think we need to see, it is going to need to include the fact that men and women may need to share in different ways, and that where I would say I see a lot of women wanting to share for the sake of the sharing, and that brings release. With a lot of men, it needs to be more sharing with a view to how have you solved this? Because I haven't managed to yet. And my experience is that men do pass on expertise. And in fact, that one of the things that can make a man feel very insecure and isolated is not having enough male sponsors that they can go to and just go, well, look, what do you do in this situation? So I think we can't, the comments I've made are clearly generalizations, but there is actually some research that male and female brains are different. And we have to try and build that in so that we have a more nuanced conversation than just saying clearly what we need to all do is talk about it more. Some people will need to talk about it very much behind closed doors. But we clearly, and I know it's the subject of your next book, Jo, that you're bringing out with Proper Books, is encouraging mental health conversations for men, and getting away from this idea of pretending to be fine. So I think that's really what was in my head, was not making an assumption that everybody needs the same thing, and making sure that we've got systems that allow people to express what they need. And really that we equip them with the ability to ask for what they need, because a lot of people won't speak up because they don't know how. They've never been accurately shown how to do that.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I think that's really important that there are those remits. I mean, we're obviously in a very interesting time, and hopefully there's been a real shift with us all being more on a level playing field in organizations, and it will be interesting to see what happens in the next 6-12 months in the larger corporates on some levels, because we have all entered this kind of equal zone of all just being this big on a screen. And I love that idea. I love the fact that actually all these very, very strict and classic hierarchical structures are actually just been ditched, because for some level it's all become a very equal position around the table, i.e. on Zoom or Google Meets or whatever. So hopefully more conversations, more open training, and things like that. I mean, going back to your comment, Jo, Mike Davis Marks wrote a chapter obviously in the book about how different our brains have evolved, men and female brains. I mean, really, we ideally should have this show again and get some male guests on the show. And is there a male version of you, Tara, out there somewhere?
I haven't come across one.
Not yet.
I haven't come across a female alternative.
Well, thank goodness we have you then, and hopefully your message will be passed on and passed out to many more, because I know you've got an amazing following already. But it's such an important, and I just would like to bring it back. Obviously, it only relates to, I know, a few of us here, but I know a lot of women suffer from imposter syndrome because they've been just a mother. And they may have been just a mother for 6 months, or even a friend of mine was a mother for 12 years. She gave up her career in law. She was a fully fledged lawyer. And when she was returning to work, I gave her lots of support about returning to being a role. And it literally was just an administrative role at a school. And you would think she was applying for a job as MP. She was so worried. The imposter syndrome kicked in hugely. And thankfully, by that point, Tara, you and I had already connected. So I was passing on your best advice. But I think, sadly, there's a lot of mothers that it naturally kicks in. And I'm sure it would for fathers that have been home for a long time as well. But obviously, proportionally, there are more women that spend more time at home with their kids after than men. So that's a really topical point of what is it like as a mother to return to work and the challenges. So, Tara, is there anything else you'd like to add just before we finish off this show? It's been fascinating, and I want to watch it back as soon as I can to get absorb it all again.
I wanted to just refine just a little bit, because it was wonderful. I loved what Jo was saying about the difference between men and women in terms of looking for support. And when I'm talking about looking for support, I am talking about a one-on-one conversation with somebody. Group support just doesn't seem to help with imposter syndrome, only because you'd be sitting in a room of people and online, and you'd be thinking, well, they're not really imposters. I'm the only real imposter. It doesn't get to the level of other than sharing in a connective way. And so to get to the heart of it and really help with that support, it needs that one-to-one, really being seen, somebody seeing you and accepting you for what you are and taking you for what you are and not an identity. As Kim would say, I'm not a hairdresser. It's not who you are, it's what you did at one point in your life. And for mothers, it's not who you are, it's what you have done and what you do in that moment. Is the difference between the identity and what you do is where a lot of the struggle of imposter syndrome lies. So if somebody is quite introspective, that'd be a good place to explore.
Fantastic. That's a great bit of advice. And this also, isn't there an element of actually, as a hairdresser, goodness me, the people you have sat in your chair, the people you have to counsel and listen to drone on about their life problems or their next holiday, it's just endless, isn't it? And so all those skills that and this is something I definitely really encourage with anyone that I come across who's doing a career change. Look at what you've just done and all the skills that are underneath, that are quiet skills that you won't realize that you've achieved or attained, but they're not necessarily on paper skills, but the skills like, as a listener, someone who is able to communicate and also validate and evaluate information, which is so much about leadership, Kim, isn't it?
Yeah, and to be fair, I often say to people now that I got my lessons in leadership being a hairdresser, because actually what you were taught to do was to really listen, to understand, because you needed to understand who the person was, what they wanted, what they were looking for, and what was important to them, to give yourself any kind of chance of being able to create the hairdo that they wanted to. Because we know that people go to the hairdressers to walk out feeling their best version of themselves. So you've got to understand that. And I think having spent many years thinking it was the cause of my imposter, I realized actually it was the cause of my power, because although I've seen it as a vulnerability, it was actually the thing that made me a good leader, because I could talk to anybody, and I could listen to them and understand them. And I think you're so right in that we take some of those things for granted, don't we? We think that they're not particularly skillful because we can all listen, but how many people really do? I guess
it really is.
And
by the way, there's a book there, Lessons of Leadership from a Hairdresser, because I totally agree. And not only are you dealing with what they're asking for, but you're really listening and empathizing, and then you need to remember what I said to you last time I saw you, which was 6 weeks ago. And there's so many skills involved with that. So coming on to the book. So here is our book, Women Leading. We have the next one is in its making now. So it's Women Leading Founders. It's all about women that are creating innovative businesses to change the world. And there are so many. It's remarkable. So the next Women Leading book will be focused on that. But this is our book. This has myself, Jo, and Kim in it. And it also has Dr. Alessandra Wall, who unfortunately couldn't obviously join us today from San Diego. Who knows what's happening for her, but I hope she's well and we wish her well. This book is available on Amazon. Perhaps, Tara, you could be in the next one. That would be fantastic. Or the one after that. Or we need to get you in one of them because your message... Sorry?
That'd be great. Thank you. Yes.
Your message is so important and it's so valid. And obviously, we're grateful to have you in the show today. It's been fantastic. This is the last of our season 1 of our shows of the Women Leading Show. But we will be back again on Friday, the 11th of September. And we will have quite a meaty show then. Actually, we won't talk about meat because it's all about... This is not about vegetarianism in this one, but it's we'll have our author Sonal Badiani. She is a humanitarian and she champions and campaigns for human rights and for the environment. She has written a brilliant chapter in the book. And we'll also have special guest Elizabeth Cairns, who is the empowered entrepreneur, and she's a climate change activist too. So it's going to be a great show. That's Friday, the 11th of September at 12, back to our normal time. And please feedback, please share this show. We'd like to spread the word, help support people, help women, and we can all help each other get where we want to, feeling happy, confident, and as Tara said, calm. So thank you guys. Lovely to have you on the show again. Have a great weekend all, and I'll see you next time. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.